Next up, we have someone you will want to listen to, other than me, and that's Paul Campbell. And Paul Campbell, great friend of mine, someone you all know, past president of CSOC, life member of CSOC, fellow of Engineering New Zealand, been around for a long time helping the industry. And I'm just really pleased to have him up as keynote speaker number one. If we could all give a really good hand to Paul, that's great.
Thanks, Carl. Kind words, and thank you for not giving me the hangover slot this year. So my brief from Carl was talk about professionalism, the professional engineer, the engineering technician, all in the context of a new beginning and a future focus. Summed up quite nicely in Carl's whakatauki about looking back before we can look forward. Hearing Michelle, I was tempted to get up and just go ditto and then sit back down. So, yeah, Michelle's words were inspirational. So, if you'll indulge me just slightly before we get into the main topic. It's been te kao or 10 years since Rumoko visited Otahu Christchurch. And I just wanted to acknowledge, as someone that was born and bred in Canterbury, what that's meant to us as a profession. We did write a really cool reflection piece that unfortunately didn't make it into the last journal. It will be coming into a subsequent one just because of space. But I wanted to acknowledge what happened 10 years ago. I particularly want to focus on the positive lessons we learnt out of Christchurch. So I've put 2 photos up from my sort of private collection that are quite special to me. One was the bells from the cathedral going back to the foundry where they were made to be repaired, and one was opening of the so-called container mall in Cashel Street, sort of new beginnings, if you like, to go with the conference theme. I also wanted to acknowledge I met a few people last night that I haven't seen for years. It's been 10 years and nearly 1 month since the 13th of June aftershock, which for me was one hell of a day. We nearly lost some lives that day, so yeah, I wanted to acknowledge that. I wanted to say that the Christchurch earthquake was a career highlight that I never want to repeat, and we'll move on. I wanted to give a little bit of reflections about CSOC as an organisation. It's flourished in recent history, 3,000 members. Geez, we thought when we were heading towards 2,000 we were doing really, really well. So something that I'm personally quite proud of is the emerging structural engineers. We've got a stream at this conference for the second time, and it is fantastic to see our younger people coming through and being trained, as I like to say, on the dark side of the Force. You'll have to excuse me, I'm a certain age and I like Star Wars. I attended in 2017 a talk by Ian Firth, the iStructD president at the time, and he said something that resonated with me, and I wanted to put a challenge out to our emerging professionals. And he talked about the wisdom of experience and combining it with the enthusiasm of youth. And that's always sort of resonated with me. So whilst I think it is absolutely awesome that the emerging professional engineers have got their own group, my challenge to you is, and I'll speak for myself here, invite some crusty old fellas like me along every now and again. Integrate with the wider CSOC, because I genuinely believe that it's part of our calling, of our profession, for the more experienced people to impart knowledge, to entrain the younger generation, and just as it's their job to learn from those with a bit of experience. As Michelle said, we've had some fantastic advances in diversity, and I was going to make a joke about diversity in the management committee. We've welcomed our first Australian. Right. That brings me to my next slide. No, it's not an ad for Kathmandu, it's a tent. Whilst it is fantastic that we've got 380 odd people attending this conference when the Wellingtonians get here. But that still only represents about 15% of our membership. The people in this room, thank you for coming. It is so important that you engage in the profession. It's so important that you keep learning and pushing yourself and acting in professional ways. The problems we have often are the people that aren't in the tent, the people that don't show up. So my challenge to you is spread the word. Invite people into the tent. Go back to your places of work. Share the conference papers, share the proceedings, share the knowledge you've learnt with your staff, and encourage people to participate. There we go. So, a new beginning. Let's talk a little bit about professionalism. I love the quote from David Meister of the Harvard Business School. Professionalism is not a label you give yourself. It's a description that you hope others will apply to you. I would also argue that being a professional is not a right, it is a privilege. And it is our responsibility to take that privilege seriously and address some of the issues Michelle's talked about. When you look up professionalism in the dictionary, it talks about the conduct and aims or qualities that characterise or mark a profession or a professional person. It also talks about a profession as a calling requiring specialised knowledge and often long and intensive academic preparation. I would submit to you and argue that that's what we do at university. We learn all that knowledge, but as Michelle said, it's when we get into the workforce, it's that mentoring, it's how we apply that knowledge over a lifetime that makes us and defines us professionals. And if we are lucky, the public of New Zealand will apply that title to us of being professional engineers. We can stand up until the cows come home and say we're leaders. We can say we're professionals. But what really matters is, does the public believe that? Do they genuinely believe it in their heart of hearts? Because only then can we hold our heads high and say we have achieved it. So I wanted to talk next a little bit about the engineer versus the engineering technician. So I stumbled onto a paper done by some people out of AUT here in Auckland. Oh, sorry, not here in Auckland. In Auckland, not here in Hamilton. And they talked about the depth and breadth of what's required to be an engineer or an engineering technician. Now, it's easy for me to stand up and talk about Washington Accords, Sydney Accords, Dublin Accords, but I thought this graphic summed it up quite nicely. And it's something that I want to explore a little bit later on in the talk. The concept of depth and breadth. So a professional engineer, by definition, must be able to define open-ended problems. They must be able to solve open-ended problems through the applications of first principles of engineering science. So that's more or less what the blue T on the left is showing. The right T is the blue one, is showing that in theory that takes 4 years for a Washington Accord degree to achieve that. I would say that that's the formal education process. The real test of a professional is the lifelong learning that follows on from it. But let's just stay with this graphic for a while. An engineering technician which is really, really important to our profession. They solve broadly defined problems, and they apply practice area knowledge. So not quite the depth and breadth. And in formal training, that's a 3-year degree. So if we just think about that concept, depth and breadth, and the amount of education, and we'll pause that for a couple of slides. So how are we doing as a profession? The graphic that I'm about to show you next, I made it up completely. There is no science involved. It is completely my opinion, so come and buy me a beer afterwards or hit me afterwards. I thought I'd give us a report card. And one of John Herism's, as I call it, I love this quote, 99% of all engineers think they're above average. So when we're grading ourselves, I thought we'd give ourselves some pretty good grades. Tellingly, I put some grades on there from MB, and again, if I've offended the MB people, I'll apologise later. And I put a question mark and a cross against professionalism. We're currently going through some occupational regulation, which might suggest they think that we need a little bit of a help there. I also put a bit of a cross against ethics, because that's part of the occupational regulation. I think they might trust us. I'm not sure how competent they think we are. I think they might think we've got some technical ability. And I did something again for New Zealand Inc. And what guided me and as I said, I've made that up, but what guided me on the MB scorecard and the New Zealand Inc. scorecard was the occupational regulation, and on the New Zealand Inc. side, the exponential growth in complaints, largely about structural engineers. Now that actually hurts me, because I love this profession. So new beginnings, let's do better on the next report card, not for ourselves, so not talk amongst ourselves. Let's aim to get the public and the MB perception up. And again, I made that up. So have we passed? Have we failed? I don't know. I'm not going to judge us on whether we've passed or failed on those marks, but I know going forward we must do better. A little bit about occupational regulation. I thought I'd just share a snippet of the thinking because you haven't seen the submission we put in. I think it was a really good submission. But for those of you that haven't read it, and sometimes these sorts of things are fairly dry reading, what MB are proposing in their, the consultation document talked about registration, and that's all about getting everybody in the tent really early. And it's not really a technical qualification, it's a professional one. It's about signing up to codes of ethics and things like that. And then there's a licensed engineer with a deeming safety critical. So once you get registered, you go through a gate, and that's a technical competency. And I would argue, and I think others will too, that to be a professional engineer, you need both ethical and technical competency. In my humble opinion, what is seriously lacking in the MB consultation document is what about the people that aren't covered under what they're calling safety critical, and they haven't defined that yet. What about our technicians? So I've, again, just drawn a box out the side. And my challenge to our institution is to come up with a comparative pathway for those technicians, for those people that aren't deemed safety critical, and make them go through a technical competency test. My challenge to us and our institution is there's probably not that much wrong with CPENG, to be honest. It's how it's been applied. So it's really, really, really important that going forward we get it right and we don't devolve back into the current state. We need the public and we need the regulators to start having confidence in us again. We need those disciplinary cases to come down. We need the front page of the Dominion Post and Phil Pennington to sort of have positive stories about us. So, you know, the famous quote from Einstein, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. Let's get occupational regulation right this time. Independence is vitally important, and by their own admission, Engineering New Zealand hasn't done a particularly great job of that, so let's sort it this time. Rigour is essential and consistency is essential. So I now want to pose a question. Are we behaving like professionals? Or are we actually all behaving more in the technician realm? We talked, if you go back to those T's, we talked about depth and breadth. The definition of a professional was open-ended problems. The definition of the technician was broadly defined problems. First principles engineering science versus practice area knowledge. How much of what we do we rely on codes? Do we rely on cookbooks? Have we allowed ourselves as a profession to morph more from professional engineering into engineering technician territory? Now, I'm not saying that engineering technicians are inferior people by any stretch of the imagination. You know, they've had really good training and we absolutely need them in our profession. But are we applying that critical thinking, that creativity that a professional engineer brings, or are we simply rolling out what we did last time, changing the title block, changing the address on the calcs, and just rinse and repeat? Because I would submit to you that if that's what we're doing, I don't think we're behaving the way professional engineers necessarily should. Now, sure, there's occasions where it's just like that building, we can borrow some of the things, but we can't stop thinking. We can't stop critically analysing what the problem is. Which brings me on to my next little favourite hobby horse. Don't worry, the talk gets positive towards the end. The black box. I found this graphic and I thought, genius, brilliant. What is it? Rubbish in, rubbish out, garbage in, garbage out. How much of what we do on a daily basis is devolving into black box engineering? I can't tell you the answer to this, but I know when I see an ETABS model being developed to answer this one question: have we got tension in the piles? And 3 days later, we discovered, no, we don't have tension in the piles. And a wise, grumpy person said, why the hell have you spent 3 days? Drew a box, said, what's your base shear? Put the base shear on the box, worked out the physical dimensions of it and said, no, of course it won't overturn. Okay? 10 minutes work. So thinking of professionals and technicians, how much of this black box thinking really is going on? I would subject that more often than is acceptable, we are using black box design rather than these fantastic tools to help us solve problems. We're using them to design rather than help us come up with solutions. Who still does back of envelope calculations? Fantastic. It's a lot more people, and thanks for raising your hand, by the way. Normally you ask these questions, no one sticks their hand up. I've seen people do no checking on these things, you know, a la, have we got tensions on the piles? I'm old enough to remember and Bruce, someone or other, one of the lecturers at Canterbury about 20-something years ago, and we were doing funicular polygons, and we were doing bending moments with T-squares and set squares. My point is here, I think we're trusting some of the tools a little bit too much, and I think we're relying on them too much. I can't remember the last time I assembled a stiffness matrix, but we've got to be able to have these tools and skills at our disposal to check the models. So I feel like I've ranted enough about that. But black box engineering, it really worries me. And if I could ask you to do one thing, when you go back to the office, impart that wisdom, do those back of the envelope checks, get your grads to do it. I mean, I make my grads do it by hand the first time because I'm a bit mean, but yeah. So how big's the problem? I love that slide of the iceberg. We're only seeing a little bit, I think, above the surface. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not all doom and gloom. There's some fantastic engineering going on in New Zealand. Seriously world-class stuff. But how much of this technician versus professional engineering is really going on? Whilst I don't have the answers, and I don't want to dwell on it, we got 1- and 2-story buildings in Masterton that aren't up to scratch. We've got car parks in Tauranga, office buildings in Christchurch. These are large buildings going on. The reason for the iceberg, and it's a continual problem, how much of the mistakes are being fixed up and then subject to non-disclosure and confidentiality agreements during sort of the settlement and the insurance process. So I would argue, before I leave this point and look a bit further forward, that our challenge is to go back to the office and start behaving like professional engineers. Start thinking about those first principles. In fact, just start thinking. Don't let the computers do it for us. Start critically thinking. I think Alistair Catnack got up at the last one and talked about being a bogan because he's always showing car analogies. So this is my shout out to Alistair, I'm a fellow bogan. Back to the future, I say back to basics. My dad always accused me of wanting to run before I could walk, before I could crawl. And I submit to you that maybe we should start focusing our effort on basics. I see fantastic graduates coming out of the learning institutions. I wish I was half as bright as them. But they're always running to their flying DeLorean. What's wrong with a pencil, an eraser, a calc pad? The mistakes that I'm picking up, and I've just picked one up probably this month, really, really fundamental stuff. Load paths, load paths, load paths. I think that needs to be almost our new mantra. So I guess what I'm saying here is let's not get hung up on the precision and accuracy of the nth decimal place when we haven't got the first digit right. Now, I see a lot of nodding of heads. I was speaking with Philip last night, and the article the editorial that Stuart wrote in the latest CSOC journal, let's just do some basic stuff right. One of the lessons I learnt personally in Christchurch, you're going around looking at wrecked buildings. Didn't matter whether it was a 360 UB or a 610 UB. The critical thing for that building not collapsing is there was a bloody beam where there needed to be one. So please, can we make sure we get the load paths? Can we make sure we get some structural systems in there? Can we make sure we get a bit of redundancy where we can get away with it? This has been a bit of a common theme in addresses lately, and I apologise, my name is Paul, I am sick, but I can hear Des Bull on my shoulder now going, Campbell, load paths, redundancy, symmetry. But these are words of wisdom. You know, things like don't put flexible buildings on flexible sites. You know, these are words of wisdom. Back to basics, please. Looking forward, I too, like Michelle, am very, very optimistic. Carl talked about looking back to look forward in his whakatauki. So what have we got to look forward to? Well, designs are becoming more and more complex. Digital engineering is here, and it's gaining momentum. You know, 3, 4, 5 years ago, who had heard of Rhino, BIM, Grasshopper, Revit? All of these things are rolling off the tongues at the moment. I'm not convinced that universal understanding of what they do is there yet, but digital engineering's here. When you read in the business pages about the McKinsey Foundations and all that, our sector is targeted in terms of productivity. You know, we don't seem to be making the gains in productivity of other things, and everyone's talking about AI, artificial intelligence, and all the rest of it as the way forward. So if we go back and think about the professional versus the technician, how do we reimagine ourselves going forward? How do we up our productivity? I think we've got a bit of a challenge in structural engineering. One of the issues I think we've got is just about all of our designs are bespoke. I'm yet to meet the architect that rinses and repeats. You know, we come up with new buildings all the time. We don't have that luxury of, say, Volvo, where they manufacture 1 million types of one model and they can refine it. You know, people compare us to the aeronautical industry, but that's a production line that keeps on going and going and going, and they've got all the QA in behind it. We're more bespoke. So I think our path and our way forward is to use digital engineering, use artificial intelligence, use these things as tools to do the mundane work, and we retain some of the creativity. We refocus rather than retrain ourselves to think critically about what's happening. So let's start thinking about engineering and the art versus the science. And as we start using more and more of these tools, let's use some of these tools for the mundane science tasks, and we focus on the art and the creativity and the load paths and the structural systems. And then if you needed a further sort of plug, you know, I don't see us being replaced by a computer anytime soon, because I've yet to see the computer that will be able to interact with an architect. I love our architects, really, I do. But I think our challenge going forward, you know, another I struck D thing, sometimes I just thank goodness that we're in a seismic zone, you know, because they talk about their designs becoming more organic, and they showed columns like trees and things like that. But I think as our designs become a little more complex, these tools are the key to us being able to provide good engineering. I had to chuck this picture in because I just love it. The mouse eyeballing the elephant. And I chucked this picture in principally because a lot of people think that, you know, the grasshopper, the rhino, and all these tools are only used on the convention centres and multi-billion-dollar projects and all that. No, they will be used on the smaller projects coming to you very soon. I mean, that's the way our industry's going. So we must also think when we're using these tools and when we're coming up with these systems, we must think about size and scale. It's all too often that we devolve thinking, oh yeah, we'll do that on the Sky Tower. But my little tilt slab 2-storey building in Masterton, we don't need to worry about that. We can just rinse and repeat what we've always been doing. No. Let's have this as a genuine new beginning. Let's apply the same rigour to all of the projects going forward. Let's not have a balcony collapse at the 660 concert, a balcony, for goodness sake. It's one of the most simple structures you can have. So I guess what I'm saying here is don't kid yourself that all these fancy tools and AI and all that are only for big projects. They're for our profession. My last slide. Carbon. Fantastic material. Apply enough pressure to carbon and you can either get coal or diamonds. Now, both of them are valuable. You only wear one as a ring, by the way. But I guess going forward, our profession is under great public scrutiny. Make no mistake, the public, our clients, everyone is becoming less and less tolerant of mistakes. We are under the magnifying glass like never before. Occupational regulation, if you need any evidence of this. So we are the carbon, the pressure we are under and the reputation we gain. Coal's an acceptable outcome, but it's a fossil fuel. It's a dinosaur. It's still valuable. You can still burn it. Do we want our reputation to be that of coal, or do we want it to be nice, shiny, sparkly, and that of a diamond? So have a think about that, because our behaviours as a group and as an individual on a daily basis, all of these micro behaviours add up to a lump of coal or a bright, shiny, sparkly diamond. 2 slides to go. I've really talked about 3 things in my mind today. So reflecting backwards, let's think about the positive lessons of Christchurch. I'm sick of showing pictures of damaged buildings and being all doom and gloom. There's some fantastic positives. There's new beginnings happening in Christchurch. When it comes to our emerging professionals and us as an organisation, let's combine that wisdom and the enthusiasm more often. Let's get more people in the tent. If you can do nothing else, spread the word about CSOC. Everyone needs pastoral care throughout their whole career. Let's understand, embrace and acknowledge the difference between professionals and technicians. Let's always remember that our reputation will be judged by others, not by us. Occupational regulation, in my humble opinion, the professional side of the equation that says professional plus technical equals good engineer. It's really important. Please get involved. The stuff that we've submitted to MB at the moment, that's about the law, the really high-level stuff. We've got another bout of consultation to go through where the devil will be in the detail. So please get actively involved. Embrace technology. The future really is bright and shiny. These tools are fantastic. We will be able to do things that we haven't been able to do previously. But let's not forget, it's a tool. Please don't ever stop thinking. Let's get the basics and the art right. Start having a bit more fun. And let the pressure that we're under reputationally turn us into diamonds. So, as a final word sort of to the profession I love, I've always found the more I put in, the more I get out. We need you. We need you to be involved, you know, even if it's just showing up to local structural group meetings and conferences, you know, but if anyone's got the desire to get involved in any of the working groups, we are a voluntary organisation and we rely on volunteers. But if all you do is show up from time to time around the campfire in that tent, fantastic. Bring a friend with you when you do, please. And I will leave you with what I think is quite a cool quote. What is the food of the leader? It is knowledge, it is communication. Thank you for listening to me this morning.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that very thought-provoking talk. We're actually about 5 minutes early, but if anyone wants to ask Paul some questions, or Michelle, our new president, or make any comment, that'll be great. I reckon. There's one there.
It was a great presentation. I think some of your key messages, though, Paul, I found a wee bit confusing. I think the tools we do have got at our disposal now are fantastic, but I still don't think they're at the place where we need to use them for the simpler projects. I think the problem with our industry at the moment is the tools that architects have at their disposal. Just because they can design more and more complicated buildings doesn't necessarily make them any better aesthetically, and it really creates a whole lot of noise for designers from, you know, getting back to those basics, looking at nice, regular, robust buildings with as much redundancy as we can, you know, design into them. So I think the use of Revit and Grasshopper and Rhino and all those wonderful new tools do need to be done with great care. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with designing buildings by hand.
Absolutely not. Yeah, half the time I can't get Bluebeam to work for me. Look, point taken, Craig, and well made too. My point about that was, my fear is that people that work on smaller projects just go, oh, I don't need to worry about that, that's not for me. And I guess what I wanted to do was just encourage people to embrace the tools. But yeah, horses for courses, and it always will be.
Any other questions? Anyone else want the mic? Yeah, one more random toss, Craig.
Is this working? Yeah, I'll ask a question, Paul. Following on, we were told after Christchurch that we had to push back on the architects and their weird and wonderful and their transfer structures and what have you.
Yep.
I want to ask the question, do we feel that we're being successful in doing that? Pushing back on silly structures?
I might be a politician and answer your question without answering it. No. In all seriousness, I think there was a time straight after the earthquakes where we almost had too much power and it kind of went to our heads a little bit. Have we been successful? I think we've tempered the architects a reasonable amount. I think that they're starting to swing back to some more of the, shall we say, funky stuff. And our challenge has always been and will always be around trying to make regular structural forms out of irregular architectural form. I think that what's happening, more so than the form, is what was great after the earthquakes is the engineer was being called in a dam site earlier, and we were able to influence what was happening. And I see that, certainly in the projects we're involved in, sort of morphing back, not quite to where we were, but we're not involved quite so early. But I'm going to give a talk in an hour or so, half an hour or so, with Stu Oliver on low damage design. And we worked with architects on that. And those architects had really heard the message about regularity and simplification. So I'm not saying all architects have, but there's starting to be a bit of a groundswell movement with architects understanding what makes good structural form to get resilience. So I think, we've kind of almost got a pass mark there, Scott, but there's more work to be done.
Yeah, I just want to add to that a little bit. Some of our clients, who have very large building stocks are starting to take, or have taken that on board. If you look at the Ministry of Education, who suffered quite a lot out of the Christchurch earthquakes and also had a very large portfolio that they had to deal with weather tightness issues, they've put into place codes of practice and guidelines above and beyond the building code, and are asking for more structural regularity, asking more from their architects around doing less architectural form and more around getting a bit more engineering regularity and easier maintained buildings. So some educated clients are doing that. We are seeing some moves in the industry, so there is some real positives there. Look, we now have hit time, which is great. Just before we move out, I do have some more housekeeping message, but firstly, I just really want to thank and gratefully acknowledge the following companies for making this conference possible. They're on the wall, the banners behind me. Our gold sponsors are Building Performance, the New Zealand Government, and Comfloor and Fletcher Steel. And our silver sponsors are BBR Contact, Bosfa, Conslab, Pacific Steel. Oh look, here we go, the slides turned up, excellent. Pultron and Seeker. Look, thank you very much. What that does is it gives us a little bit of extra money to do some slightly better things and put on stuff to make this a really successful conference.